Just how much is wrong with the American way of healthcare? Elisabeth Rosenthal will join us to talk about her important new book, An American Sickness.
So there was a feeling that nobody pays. And when the feeling is that nobody pays, then, of course, all of the providers think, well, if I'm charging $100 for this, I could charge $200, or I could charge $500, or I could charge $5,000.
Is there a rape crisis on campus, or is it all manufactured hysteria? Jill Filipovic will join us to talk about her new take on two books with pointedly contrarian views of gender, sex, and violence.
Kipnis certainly recognizes that rape happens and sexual violence on campus happens. But her argument is that we've sort of relied on these really regressive stereotypes of men either as predatory or potentially predatory, and women as victims or potential victims.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Elisabeth Rosenthal joins us now from Washington. She is the author of An American Sickness, How Healthcare Became Big Business and How You Can Take It Back. Elizabeth, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you were a reporter at the New York Times for many years until very recently. What did you cover while you were here at the Times?
I covered a wide variety of beats, but I trained as a doctor before I came to the New York Times. And so initially I came to the Times to cover, remember this, the Clinton health reform in the 90s. Mm-hmm. I assumed that I would leave medicine to cover the Clinton health reform and then go back to medicine. And of course, the Clinton health reform never happened, and I never went back to medicine. I stayed at the Times for 22 years. I had beats overseas in China. I covered international environment issues, which I was very passionate about. But the debate over the Affordable Care Act and what happened subsequently drew me back into medical reporting and healthcare reporting.
So you were a practicing doctor before you joined the Times?
Yes, but I'd always been a practicing and passionate writer as well on the side. So I tried to balance those two things. And over time, I realized that really that the healthcare system, I felt even then in the 90s, was rather dysfunctional, and so I could add more writing about medicine than working in an emergency room and experiencing it every day.
One of the series that people remember you for is pretty recent, the Paying Till It Hurts series. I'm assuming this book came out of that reporting.
Yes, it did in many ways. I didn't want to cover just the Affordable Care Act because I thought the problems with healthcare went deeper. So I went to Dean Baquet, who's now editor-in-chief, and said, what I really want to understand is why healthcare in this country is so expensive. Why do we pay the prices we do? And I didn't want to focus on those really, really big-ticket items like cancer care or end-of-life care, because I think a lot of people read those stories and think, wow, that's really scary, but I'm going to make better decisions, or I hope I never get that disease.
Right. They think that's an extreme case.
Right. So we wanted to focus on the everyday in that Paying Till It Hurts series, and that's what we did, and it got a huge response. We focused on colonoscopies, we focused on getting stitches in the ER, asthma inhalers, things that everyone could relate to. And what happened after that is I kind of got re-hooked on healthcare and understood even more how increasingly dysfunctional the American healthcare system had become. And even more than that, I would say, as a result of that series, we did a lot of experimentation with social media, and we had comments flooding in. I think literally in the end, tens of thousands of comments. And I started a Facebook group out of that series, too, where I got even more stories. And people were telling me these, really distressing stories about how their health care had impacted their family's finances. These are New York Times readers, too, so they're mostly pretty well insured. And I thought, if these people are having trouble, everyone's having trouble. And basically, when the series finished, I just had so many stories and so much more insight from all these comments that had come in that the natural thing was, wow, I've got to write a book. The other thing I think is that when you're writing a series of newspaper articles, You see that the system is dysfunctional as a whole, but you have to, by virtue of the medium, pick off different parts of the system. And I really wanted to write a book to put it all together because I began to see that there was no one bad guy. And I think we're always looking for a bad guy in medicine. You know, why are the premiums so high? Is it the insurers? Is it the pharma companies charging too much? Is it the doctors? Is it the surgery centers? And what I came to see as a result of the series was it's everyone. It's the system. And so I wanted to write a book showing how that evolved, how all the parts of the system kind of pushed each other into this inflationary spiral. And I would include in that patient attitudes. We've been complacent and allowed this system to evolve as it has.
How did you start the story? I mean, how far back do you need to go to talk about how we got to where we are now?
You know, there's no one clear starting block where there was a switch flipped and suddenly we got into this madness. And in many ways, the last 10 years are where it's become really, really exaggerated. But it's the kind of slow infusion of business into healthcare that's really behind the inflation and into all aspects of healthcare. So, you know, you could say if you wanted to pick a starting date that it was the evolution of health insurance. Not because health insurance is bad, should I say. I think health insurance is good. Everyone should have it. The government should make sure everyone has it in some way or another. But what happened when you have health insurance, particularly the kind of health insurance that many of us had 20, 30 years ago, was there was this sense that nobody was really paying for anything. So you went to the doctor, there was this attitude, even when I was practicing, of why don't we just order this test? Because for those of us old enough to remember it, you know, over 10 years ago, insurance pretty much covered the cost of things, and you didn't have to pay a lot out of pocket. So there was a feeling that nobody pays. And when the feeling is that nobody pays, then, of course, all of the providers think, well, you know, if I'm charging $100 for this, I could charge $200, or I could charge $500, or I could charge $5,000. And the providers themselves, you know, the doctors might not be so inclined to do that. But what we see in the 90s in particular is the infusion of more and more business people into medicine who wanted to make the bottom line work. And many of those were working in profit-driven sectors. And for them, it was like, Yahoo, we can charge whatever the market will bear. And guess what? Because there was a sense that no one was really paying this, the market bore a lot. And that's how we end up with these $150,000 for a hip replacement that in another country might cost $10,000. Even on the private market, we're not talking about subsidized medicine.
Right.
We're talking about real costs.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up other countries because it seems that America is really an outlier here, that in other rich countries, the government provides coverage to all citizens and also, on the other end, provides a pressure to make sure that the market doesn't take advantage of that. Why not here?
Why not here is a big question. I think what you see as you look around the world, and part of my impulse to write this book was that I'd been a foreign correspondent in a lot of other countries, so I'd experienced a lot of other health systems. And when I came back to the U.S., to the home base of the New York Times, I was mystified because the inhaler I might have bought for $10 in Rome was suddenly $100 in the U.S. And antibiotics, I remembered from when I was in medical training that I knew were long, long off patent, like Unwanted. My kids had had lots of ear infections. Off patent, they were 10 times more expensive than they'd been when they were brand new. And so I was kind of mystified about what's going on here. And I think one of the important lessons for me in looking at other countries is you don't have to have one kind of system or another to get reasonably priced care. I mean, some countries do it with what we like to call socialized medicine, where the government owns the hospitals and everyone is enrolled in a national health program. Others, like Switzerland, use a much more market-based approach. But even those that use a more market-based approach where they give people choices of insurers and choices of providers, there is some mechanism for limiting price. They may not say, oh, this is what you have to charge for an MRI, although many do. But they may say, okay, this is the ceiling of what you can charge. And you guys, you can compete below that ceiling, but you can't go above it. I mean, look, Japan has a single payer, but a market-based system where the hospitals and the doctors are private. But an MRI in Japan costs around $100, whereas in the U.S. it can cost anywhere from $500 to $10,000. It's completely arbitrary and all over the map. And people from other countries look at the U.S. and say, why do you guys tolerate that?
When you talk to the various interested parties in the current medical system, it sounds like no one is doing well. You know, doctors will say, I have to see patients back to back every 15 minutes. I have no time. If I don't do this, if I don't refuse to accept insurance, if I don't make these various changes, I would make no money. Or you hear from pharmaceutical companies saying, well, we have to charge this kind of price for these drugs because we spend so much time researching drugs that save lives, and that's incredibly costly. I mean, is that all true?
Well, at some level, all of these things are kind of true, and in some cases it's true, but a lot of drug companies do very little research and development. And we know that they sell the same exact drugs they sell here for much less in every other developed country. So what's that about? They'll say, well, you know, we sell them at a loss in some of these countries, so we rely on the U.S. profits to support our research and development. So I guess as an American, I would say to that, well, fine, charge everyone else a little more and have us pay what everyone else pays.
One of the things that made the series Paying Till It Hurts and this book so powerful are the stories. Can you leave us with one story that exemplifies something wrong, or maybe a lot of things wrong, with the current healthcare system?
I'm deeply indebted to all the patients in this book who told their stories, who contacted me and were willing to have their names used, in many cases to diss the system, in the service of having people understand how the healthcare system works and how to make it work better for them. One woman who contacted me while I was writing the book was Kathleen Williams. She had been on a bike ride, the kind of bike ride we all go on over weekends. She'd gotten in a minor bike crash on a bike path, landed on the ground, and she knew something was wrong. And so, of course, you know, people are like, oh, we're going to call an ambulance. They call an ambulance. She's not seriously injured. She knows that, but she knows she's not well enough to, like, get on her bike and ride off again. So she considers calling her husband and decides, no, I'm fine. They're going to call the ambulance. So the ambulance takes her to the hospital. They diagnose a small arm fracture, and she doesn't really think much more of it until she gets a bill for $835 and was told, you're going to have to pay this. And she's thinking, what? This is the county fire department ambulance that's taking me to the hospital? So she calls and she thinks there must be a mistake. The fire department ambulance says, oh, no, you know, we bill customers now. This is not like putting out fires. We charge for this. And P.S., we don't participate with your insurer. So this is an out-of-network charge. So poor Kathleen starts arguing with her insurer, starts arguing with the fire department, saying, how can you not be part of the largest insurer network in Ohio? I mean, this is crazy. And they're like, nope. She says, can I give you $500 instead of $835? They go, nope, it's all or nothing. So finally, she's so angry that she sets up a payment plan where she's going to pay them $10 a month, essentially for the rest of her life. And she says, you know, that was all I could do to get back at these people. But I didn't know that. I didn't realize ambulances, even ambulances that are run by our local municipalities, are now often for-profit ventures with joint venture financing. Who knew that? And how crazy is it that our local fire department ambulance wouldn't be a public service like putting out fires or policing?
Yeah, I think I'm a little too stunned to answer any of those questions. That is a really appalling story, and there are lots of them in your book. Elisabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The book again is An American Sickness, How Healthcare Became Big Business and How You Can Take It Back by Elisabeth Rosenthal. There are two new books looking at campus rape and sexual harassment. Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus, and The Campus Rape Frenzy, The Attack on Due Process at America's Universities. I'm going to flip the normal equation here. Jill Filipovic is in the studio to talk about these two books, and while in accordance with the other subject of this week's podcast, I was homesick, but still talking to Jill about this week's review. Jill, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So both of these books look at rape on campus. Let's start with the issue itself. How big an issue is it? How prevalent is sexual assault on college campuses today?
Well, I mean, that's kind of one of the really key quibbles of both of these books. Anti-rape activists, feminist activists, in even the Obama administration framed campus rape as a huge and pressing issue, something that happened to 1 in 5 women, which is the stat for sexual assault in college. And both of these books suggest that those figures have been overblown and that they've been used to start this kind of witch hunt that has targeted young men and essentially made colleges a very hostile place for their male students. I didn't necessarily find that argument super convincing, but that's the place that both of these books start from.
Let's go back to that basic statistic because obviously it sounds dramatic. 1 in 5 college women will be sexually assaulted. But I would love to get a better sense of what does that mean and how that statistic was arrived at. So I guess the first question is, how is sexual assault defined in those statistics?
So this is something that in the Johnson and Taylor book, they spend a lot of time on. And they take issue with the fact that sexual assault is defined pretty broadly, and that in the surveys that determine what number of young women have been sexually assaulted, the survey isn't asking, have you been the victim of sexual assault? It asks, has somebody kissed you when you didn't want it? Has somebody touched you in a sexual way without your consent? They kind of ask these broad questions to get to sexual assault, but they don't have women define it themselves. To me, as somebody who's a feminist-minded writer, that makes sense. A lot of women who do experience sexual assault don't define it as such. And being groped without your consent does seem to me to be pretty clearly assault. But both of these books seem to think that that is an inappropriate way to define sexual assault and to conduct surveys on it.
It sounds clear that sexual assault is not necessarily rape, that it's a broader category that can include a wide range of unwanted or unsolicited or inappropriate sexual advances.
It's a much broader category. And, rape is only sort of a small percentage of the sort of range of behaviors that count in sexual assault statistics.
And I guess the other question then is with regard to the methodology, when it's 1 in 5 college women will be sexually assaulted, that is coming from surveys of women. It's not coming from actual reported cases on campus or law enforcement statistics.
Right. It's definitely not coming from law enforcement statistics. And when you look at the law enforcement statistics, you see dramatically lower numbers, which makes sense because I don't think young women are going to go around reporting to police every time a guy at a frat party kisses them without their consent, right?
Right. So that's, I imagine, part of the controversy. Well, why didn't they report this? And how do we necessarily know that it's true? And how are they defining it? I'm just trying to get a sense of sort of the argument that I expect the authors of both of these books might make. So let's look at the two books. Are they both making the same argument? The first, Unwanted Advances by Laura Kipnis, and then The Campus Rape Frenzy by Casey Johnson and Stuart Taylor Jr.?
They're making similar and I would say overlapping arguments, but one argument that they both make is that the Title IX process, which is the process by which universities investigate and punish any accusations of sexual assault, that process is Byzantine. It is not reflective of American legal norms. It's often done kind of in secret, and there seems to be not a lot of consistency both within universities and then between university systems of how that system operates, and that it's fundamentally unfair. Both of the books make that claim. Kipnis looks at the sort of campus sexual assault debate in the broader context of gender norms and stereotypes, and has kind of a broader cultural critique about what this says about the current state of sort of American sexual politics. The campus rape frenzy looks at it more from the frame of a lot of women are lying and innocent men are being railroaded, which was an argument that I think for a feminist reader is probably going to be a bit less convincing.
Well, let's talk about Laura Kipnis. For readers who are not familiar with her, just a little bit of background. Who is Kipnis and what are her previous books and what perspective is she coming from?
Kipnis is a professor at Northwestern University, and she's a bit of a polemicist. She wrote a book called Against Love.
I think the subtitle of that book was A Polemic.
Yeah, exactly. So she's certainly not hiding that is who she is sort of stylistically. She's somebody who enjoys poking hornets' nests and making sort of difficult and controversial arguments. And, reading her book, that's certainly the place that she's coming from. And you almost kind of feel like you're in the classroom with her and she's a professor pushing you far beyond your comfort zone just to really get you to think through the arguments that you're making, which can be sort of an infuriating way to read a book, but it is also really compelling and really fascinating.
She says that men are the real victims here, not women. What exactly does that mean?
Kipnis certainly recognizes that rape happens and sexual violence on campus happens. But her argument is that we've sort of relied on these really regressive stereotypes of men either as predatory or potentially predatory, and women as victims or potential victims. And that's the frame through which we're defining what used to be sort of considered normal sexual and romantic ambiguities. And then that both kind of targets men through the Title IX process who may lose their jobs or, lose their position on campus, but that it also kind of undermines the sort of normal excitement and sexual engagement and process by which young people kind of figure out what their boundaries are and how romantic life works. And that she does see the kind of people that suffer the most from this new framework as being men who are then punished on campus for what she considers kind of normal behavior.
She also says that it's hypocritical of feminists to cast women as sort of inherently sexually vulnerable as the constant victims in these situations. But at the same time, you say that in her portrayal of women, they're often depicted as scheming and vengeful and histrionic. How does she handle that contradiction?
I don't think particularly well. Most of the women in her book are vindictive, histrionic, people that are prone to lying and sort of purposefully lying, whereas the men are all these kind of like bumbling fools who maybe like made bad decisions, not because they were bad people, just because they're kind of idiots. And I don't know that she really addresses that in the book. She seems to kind of trade out one stereotype of women as inherently vulnerable and not thoughtful actors in their sex lives, and subs in this other very long-standing stereotype of women, who certainly are actors, but they're vindictive actors and they're motivated by a kind of sexual revenge over men.
Let's talk about the second book, The Campus Rape Frenzy, The Attack on Due Process in America's Universities by Casey Johnson and Stuart Taylor Jr. And let's start with the authors. Who are they and where are they coming from?
So the authors are both libertarian-minded men who often write about, what they see as the sort of problems of identity politics and the threat of anti-racist feminist style liberalism. They are certainly coming at this issue, I think, from an angle that is already pretty inherently critical of feminist activism and social justice activism on campus, which they see as kind of a broader corrosive force.
How do they make that their argument in this book?
They look at a series of sexual assault cases, some very high profile and some not, to basically make the case that false accusations are pervasive and that actual sexual violence on campus, while it's a problem, is not nearly as significant of a problem as the Obama White House and feminist activists say it is. They sort of manage, I think, to try and find every false accusation possible and put it in the book.
And they also castigate the news media, you say, for sort of too readily believing the stories of alleged rape survivors and sort of not independently investigating these cases.
They spend quite a bit of time castigating the news media. And, the only kind of media outlets that they seem to think do a good job on this are Fox News and a couple other right-wing outlets, and a few, sort of explicitly conservative or libertarian or anti-feminist writers and reporters. Those are the only folks that are in the news that seem to get kind of positive treatment from this book. But the same kind of investigative work that the authors, demand that the news media does also don't really do in the book themselves. So they're very critical of the Times for when they're writing about a rape case not going to the bar where the alleged rapist met his alleged victim, not interviewing, the bartender to ask, like, how drunk was this young woman? But then they, for example, rely on the statements of, a accused sexual assailant's mother and her characterization of the young woman who says that she was assaulted. So they don't themselves bring kind of a high degree of critical thinking to these accusations either.
It sounds like you were not persuaded by the arguments that they make in the book. I'm curious, though, was there anything that you found particularly well argued in the book, or it's something that was surprising or new to you?
Yeah, I think the part of the book that I really wanted more of was the discussion about due process norms. And that, I think, is a really valuable and important piece of this that doesn't, because it's a bit legalistic and boring, doesn't get the kind of in-depth treatment that it should. And, so they do spend some amount of time talking about basically what process should universities use. Right now, many universities use what's called the preponderance of the evidence standard, where they look at the accusations and they look at the person defending themselves, and they basically say, like, which one sort of tips just over 50%. And that is kind of who they go with. And the argument that these authors make is basically that universities should be out of this entirely, that not only is that standard not fair, but that the only fair standard for any accusation of sexual assault would be the standard used in the criminal justice system.
Well, it's confusing for people who are not trained lawyers. It does seem like an odd situation that you have, basically two very different legal systems that coexist, that universities have a different kind of way of educating sexual assault that actually does compromise the rest of the country's due process norms. Why is that? I mean, you're a trained lawyer, and
right.
So I'm assuming you have an opinion on this.
I think one thing that both authors of this get right is that the university systems are so kind of shrouded in mystery that it's very difficult to even assess what it is they're doing, because many of them aren't particularly public about it. But the university systems typically look a lot more like the civil justice system rather than the criminal system. So, the system by which, like, you would sue somebody versus trying to put somebody in jail. And so within that system, it does make sense, I think, to have a slightly lower standard for finding somebody responsible, because you're not taking away their liberty, right? You're not putting them in jail. What you're trying to do is make a victim something close to whole again, whether that means like removing a perpetrator from campus or suspending him or whatever it is. And so it makes sense that, that the sort of innocent until proven guilty, very, very high standard of proof isn't what you need to meet, because you are kind of meting out a far less serious punishment. But that said, the standard of proof that universities use, some of them use this preponderance of the evidence standard, and some seem to use sort of slightly higher standards, but it's not always clear to the people who are adjudicating these things what those standards mean, what kind of evidence you should bring in. In many cases, somebody who's accused is not allowed to confront or ask questions of the person accusing him. And often the person who's accused isn't even really fully informed of the scope of the accusations and what the evidence is, and isn't allowed to present his own evidence, which is sort of very far from what the civil system looks like. And so, one real strength of both of these books is that I do think they point out just how little anyone in this system kind of seems to know what they're doing, and most especially students who are accused, how confused they are, and how there's no real resource for them to figure out what's allowed and how they can best defend themselves.
It sounds like neither book provides the kind of cool-headed analysis of the subject that you think is probably needed, but nonetheless, both ask provocative questions.
Yes, and, both are quite challenging books, even though I would not imagine that many feminist-minded readers are going to read them and love them. I do think they're both interesting and really important and challenging contributions to what is now, I think, a very important national debate.
All right. Well, Jill, thank you so much for weighing in.
Thank you for having me.
Jill Filipovic is a contributing opinion writer at The Times. She's also the author of The H Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness. And this week, she reviews 2 books about sexual assault on campus, Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus by Laura Kipnis, and The Campus Rape Frenzy, The Attack on Due Process at America's Universities by Casey Johnson and Stuart Taylor Jr. Alexandra Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we're going to be political this week.
Once again, politics seems to be infusing everything in the culture, including publishing. The big book deal that was announced this week was for Joe Biden and his wife, Dr. Jill Biden. They are selling their memoirs to Flatiron Books in what is rumored to be a very large deal, although not an Obama-sized deal. The estimate that Publishers Weekly had from talking to a few underbidders was around $8 million, which is substantial. And I think these will be extremely well-read books. I mean, he's a very popular figure.
So they're 2 separate books.
There's actually 3 books. Former Vice President.
The dog is also.
If only. Perhaps we can count on that later down the road, a photo book of the dog. Former Vice President Joe Biden's 2 books. One will explore the year in which he tackled some of the biggest challenges that they faced in the White House while enduring the death of his son, Beau. And so it's really more than a political memoir. And then there'll be another title by Jill Biden. And there's not too much information about that, but it's interesting that once again we're seeing a couple, from the White House doing a joint deal. And when the Obamas did it just recently, it was sort of new. That's
going to be the new thing, husband and wife book deals.
Sure. I mean, why not sell it as a package? Get more money, imagine the tour possibilities. So this was a significant deal, not quite what the rumored sum was for the Obama book deal, which was, people said, $65 million for their books, which went to Crown. So we'll see. And again, no titles, no pub dates yet, but it'll be interesting to see when these books come out.
And on the other side of the aisle?
On the other side of the aisle, of course, we have to be bipartisan on this podcast. There was a fabulous story in our paper by Catherine Rosman, about sort of how children's publishers are struggling to produce what is a sort of typical category for them, presidential biographies. They do this every 4 years when there's a new president, or every 8 years when there's a new president. They put out these biographies of the leader of the country for young readers, sometimes as young as, 8 or so. And it was a real struggle for many of them this year because, for one thing, President Trump didn't have a long political history to draw on or a military background. So there was sort of the biographical information was a little harder to pull together. And, of course, there were all the controversies that affected the campaign and that continue to kind of emerge in his presidency. And children's publishers weren't sure how far down that road to go. I mean, they wanted to be very diplomatic about it. They also, understand that parents have strong political views now. There's not kind of a unified, even a area of objective reality to draw on or facts that people can agree on. So they were really working hard to kind of toe the line there and do something even-handed. But it was interesting. Katie really you could hear in the quotes that she got from these publishers that people were really struggling and trying hard to be diplomatic.
Well, here are some of the results. I'm going to quote from A True Book, President Donald Trump. And here is part of his bio. The Grand Hyatt New York Hotel was a beautiful 25-story building made of stainless steel and bright windows. The hotel was a huge success. The Grand Hyatt project made Trump the most well-known builder in New York. He had even bigger ideas. His next project would be one of the most sensational buildings in New York City. Okay, sticking to the facts, here's from A Kid's Guide to America's First Ladies. First ladies like Pat Nixon and Betty Ford worked as models, but Melania is the only one to have had a successful career and also the only one who posed nude. At 5'11", She is tied with Michelle Obama and Eleanor Roosevelt for tallest first lady.
That's quite a fact to drop into a children's book.
It is indeed. And
hopefully this isn't illustrated.
Here's a touching moment from Ivanka Trump, A Brand of Her Own. Ivanka's life was further turned upside down when, at the age of 15, she transferred to Choate Rosemary Hall, a boarding school in Connecticut. Ivanka was not happy there. She was cut off from her friends back in Manhattan. To her, the boarding school felt like a prison.
Well, I'm sure some boarding school children will be able to relate to that if they read the book.
Yes. So lots of interesting material for children everywhere about the Trump family. All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
I've gathered a bunch of people from the office to talk about what we're reading. We've got Greg Coles, John Williams, and Parl Sagel joining us now. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela. Hi, Pamela.
All right, Parl, you've come here with no material, so I'm starting with you.
Again, just my
memorized it all. What are you reading?
Well, I can't talk about most of what I'm reading because I'm writing about it, so there's no point. But I do want to talk about a book I just finished and that I've written about in this week's. The reviews, the essay's coming out in this week's book review, and it's a book called Gachar Gochar. It's one of the first books to be published in America that was originally written in Canada. And Kannada is a language that's spoken in Karnataka, which is the southern part of India. And it's about 40 million people speak this language. And so I review a lot of books. I don't recommend a lot of books just because it's very hard. And I find it's like setting up friends. It makes me anxious. But this is one of the few books I feel like I can recommend to anyone. If you read, you don't read. You're well-versed in, Indian literature. You could care less. It's so good. It's 119 pages. It's suspenseful. It's funny. It's sad. It's shocking. It's got a great kind of cliffhangery ending. And so I really think it's a book that I feel like is a gateway drug into reading generally. And if you've never read a book in translation, start here. If you haven't read a book about India today, again, start here. It's just... I think that what we all want in books essentially is short and suspenseful, and it has both of them. And then there's an interesting, sort of very interesting backstory. Like the author Vivek Shanbhag wasn't a full-time writer. I think he's only now writing full-time. He was an engineer, and he would wake up every morning at 5 and just read Chekhov for a couple of hours and try writing. And it really does feel like it has this very inward gaze. Like it wasn't written almost for people or to, it was really written for somebody out of their own love of literature. And it feels private in this kind of really interesting, exciting way to me.
This is a book that's actually been compared to Chekhov by some readers. It's also a book that seems to play a bit with The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, it's. In short, the story is this very sort of ruthless family gets rich, worst thing for a ruthless family, and sort of thus begins their moral decline. And it plays on sort of like Gatsby themes. It's got this kind of fable-like aspect from Chekhov, from Isaac Babel, from the Russians. And then it has this very particular, to me at least, Indian theme of where do I end and my family begin? This idea of how can I separate myself from my people and have a private life? What does it mean to have a private life? Yeah, I could not recommend it.
You talk in your column about how, in some ways, it's contrary to everything that we think of as the great Indian novel.
Right.
It's tiny.
It's not a
magical.
Suitable boy.
No,
yes,
it's not.
Exactly.
And it's especially interesting in a year where we have Arundhati Roy's new book is coming out, I think, in June, right? So we're going to be talking again about what the Indian novel is. And that's a book that, again, has that kind of scope that is a metaphor for the nation. That's what these books do. A Suitable Boy, Midnight's Children, they're all reenacting this big cacophonous country full of deep tragedy but insane silliness. And, this is a book it's stiletto sharp. It's tiny.
Gachar Gochar.
Gachar Gochar. So it really does feel like an interesting rejoinder to these ideas.
I brought a copy home last week based on Parl gave me this
I'm
pitch
kind
in
of just
person in the office.
I can't. I'm so sorry. I'm really out of control when it comes to
fantastic.
this book. But I really do love it, and I think everybody should read it.
John, do you feel the same way about the two books right in front of you there?
I feel the same way about the first one for sure. I've talked about Vivian Gornick on the show before, like last year sometime, I think. And I'm so happy because I thought I was done with all of her books. She hasn't written a ton. And I thought that I'd read all of them. But there's this collection called Approaching Eye Level, which I took with me on a recent brief vacation. And it's really great. The only thing I'll say is that the first essay, and it's fairly extended, it's maybe 30 pages, is about basically street life in New York and the way that it nourishes her. And she's so great on that subject. And she wrote about it a lot in her last memoir, The Odd Woman in the City, which is another very good book. And I thought that the whole book was going to be that kind of just riffing on walking around the streets of New York and anecdotes about things she overheard between crazy or charming people, and it's not. It's just a self-contained piece, and then she goes on to like profiles of her friends and and her ideas about feminism, and those are also great. But in that first essay, it's really her at her best, which I think is better than just about any living writer, in my opinion. So I would definitely recommend that one. The other one is something we talked about on the show recently. Greg did a great interview with the author and translator, which is a novel called Ties by Domenico Starnone. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
And it's a short novel. It is apparently, according to our reviewer, Rachel Donadio, and Greg agrees, in conversation with a novel by Elena Ferrante called Days of Abandonment. And apparently, again, Starnone is married to the writer who is Elena Ferrante. And I love Days of Abandonment. That's one of my favorite things from that I've read in the past few years. So I picked this up. I didn't love this quite as much, but it's very good. It's very elegant. It's concise. It talks about a man who essentially has an affair with a much younger woman and therefore distresses his marriage, almost ends his marriage, and then from 40 years later looks back on it and, you know, how the marriage survived. And you get some of the kids' perspective and how they felt at the time the affair was happening, and then much later when they're adults and their parents are elderly.
So it's very different from Days of Abandonment.
Well, it's sort of like
structurally
only her inside her mind.
Exactly. And I think that's sort of why I liked Days of
Mm-hmm.
Abandonment more. There's this kind of claustrophobic, the woman's mind is so interesting and goes everywhere, and it's very random. It's not very plot driven. And this is a bit more traditional, and the guy is maybe a little less interesting than the woman is in Days of Abandonment. I mean, his sins are a little more conventional. He's with this very attractive younger woman. The guy's not, you know, at loose ends like the woman is, and doesn't see the world quite as kaleidoscopically. But it ends with this.
No, you cannot end. You have to. Don't spoil.
No. Okay. I won't spoil. I won't tell you why it happens or who. But there's a sort of speech that a character gives towards the end that's this sort of Larkin-esque, you know, railing against family and having children, and it's 3 or 4 pages of just really intense, dark, funny prose, and it's very different than the rest of the book, which I really enjoyed that in particular.
That was Elena Ferrante's part.
Exactly. Greg, what about you?
Well, I'm still, of course, reading The Power Broker, but it's raining today, and that's a book that's really literally too big to fit in my work satchel, so I just carry it by hand, and I didn't want to carry it in the rain.
You're really grappling
like it
for
really is. You wandering around with this book around your neck.
Yeah, this is the anvil I'm carting.
It's a book you don't want to get wet and bloated because if it doubled in size.
It's big enough already.
Never be able to read it.
And so instead, the Times is getting ready to go through some design changes, changing our workstations, and part of that is requiring us to go through and get rid of or relocate some of the many, many books that we have stockpiled
Our
over
giveaway
the
shelves
years.
right now, I have to say, are really awesome because they're all the books that many of us have intended to read for a really long time and wanted to, but just didn't make the cut. So there's actually some really good books there.
All like from 6 or 7 years
That's
ago,
right.
the books that we've been
We're
hoarding.
basically just trading them to other people at this
I know.
point.
I
We're
keep
just
looking at them and
taking
trying to
other
think, like, whose cast-offs are these?
And Greg's got the good stuff, and I know this because I go through.
Well,
the
and so
shelves after
as anyone will know who has ever tried to winnow the piles, the problem with that is that you can't help yourself from starting to flip through them. And so
now I know where your animus with Marie Kondo lies. She says, don't open the books.
She says,
you're not
you
allowed.
can't open the books or you're in the wormhole. And I am right now in the wormhole.
You're going to end up aligning with her.
Never. The book that I have opened with great delight, it's a book that I have read in pieces as they've appeared in other places, but I had never picked it up as a book in itself, is Zadie Smith's Changing My Mind, Occasional Essays. And this is Zadie Smith's criticism, mostly reviews and essays about literature. There's some appreciations and things. She's just got such clarity of thought as a reader, and she approaches her reading both as a great, passionate reader, but also, of course, as a writer. And so the essay that I'm reading right now is on Roland Barthes and Nabokov. It's on the death of the author, the Barthes essay, and on Nabokov as kind of a countering voice to this idea of the death of the author. That's kind of Zadie Smith is very, very good at binary arguments.
She had that very well-known
That's right,
piece
the
about-
McCarthy versus
two roads for the essay. That's
yeah.
in here as well. And so she's very good at identifying kind of a thesis and an antithesis and pursuing them to see where they might lead her. And so this one it's called Rereading Bart and Nabokov. It is kind of examining where the power lies in the relationship between the writer and the reader. And for her, she toggles. She's got this paragraph early on. In my own reading life, I've been pulled first in one direction, then in the other. Reading has always been my passion, my pleasure, and I'm constitutionally drawn to any thesis that gives power to readers, increasing their freedom of movement. But when I became a writer, writing became my discipline, my practice, and I felt the need to believe in it as an intentional, directional act, an expression of an individual consciousness. And so she's got this tension going on, whether she's the writer or the reader. And it's this kind of fruitful examination of how much independence the reader should have in approaching the work and how much independence the writer should have in writing it.
It's so good. I still think it's I think it's her best book. And I think that she can do something that I think a lot of people want to do and nobody really can do, which is write from, to use an academic word, an embodied place.
Yeah.
Right? So she writes and she's sort of considering literature and music and film as a mother, as a wife, as, the child of a Jamaican mother.
It's true.
And
She's
a British
always
person. And
very
she can
present.
do it.
in
She
these-
brings herself in, and I don't know how she does it. I mean, it's not something that I'm particularly inclined to do, but we see a lot of these pieces where people are sort of situating themselves in their lives and looking at art. And it's a very difficult.
I'm glad you reminded me of that book because it's something that's been on my shelf too for a long time.
Yeah,
I've read a few of the pieces as they've come out, so that I think lessens my motivation to pick it up. But I'm going to now.
Gornick, it occurs to me, are some of the best people writing about New York today. Some of
That's
Zadie Smith's
true.
new stuff, which is not
the
in
stuff
this
she's
collection.
done in New York Review,
right? It's so
and
good.
just kind of, again, walking around and what she sees and then connecting it to what's going on either in her life or in the world.
Gornick on New York just reminds you why you moved here, which is so great.
Gornick, she's impossibly
It can be
good on
hard
it.
to remember sometimes. Pamela, a lot of recommendations this week. How strongly do you feel about what you're reading?
Well, I'm not in it far enough to say whether I recommend it, but I'm reading The Belly of Paris by Émile Zola, which is sort of part of my project that began with Les Miserables to actually finally read French books that I had been putting off because I was waiting to read them in French. And as you all know, that I figured was not going to happen until, my dotage. Although I have to say that I am considering turning from the English to the French, or at least reading them alongside each other, because I'm a little uncertain about the translation. The only other Zola that I've read is Germinal, and I loved that book so much because of its realism and the depiction of the coal miners, and I feel like that and John Sayles' film Matewan, makes me feel a bit of trepidation about the current tiering of the return of coal mining, also for other reasons. But anyway, what I loved about that book was just the emotional truth of it, the realism, and I'm not quite getting that with this, so I'm a little bit curious if the tone may be a little bit different in the translation. But one thing I do like about the translation, which is by Mark Kurlansky, or about this edition, is that he also writes the introduction. And Kurlansky wrote the book Cod, which is
that's right.
I did a double take.
Yes. I didn't know that he translated French, but apparently this is what he does in his free time. This is his translation of Émile Zola, and it starts off with a really terrific introduction that talks about the main character, Florent, moves back to Paris from, he escapes prison, basically, an exile in French Guiana, and specifically from Devil's Island. And French Guiana was in the news again just last week because there's all kinds of political chaos there. It's a former penal colony, which isn't often a great place to start country-wise or colony-wise.
Some baggage.
Yes. Devil's Island is famous, of course, for being where Alfred Dreyfus was exiled, and Émile Zola, of course, wrote the J'accuse and was his great defender. And what Kurlansky does is he goes and he visits Devil's Island, also called Cayenne, and it's not actually the main part of French Guiana. It's a teeny-weeny little island off the coast, and apparently Dreyfus's prison is still there, or it was at least as of his visit in 1986. And you can go and sit in the little tiny room that Dreyfus spent his prison time in on that island. So that was really lent it an interesting angle. And I will continue on with the story itself.
I'm sensing
next
part
week.
of your next vacation.
No, thanks, John.
History buff.
Only in your dreams. All right, guys, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.